In our last video, we talked about how important vaccination is and how vaccination has really decreased rates of infection worldwide. So what I'd like to talk about in this section is how, through a combination of vaccination, public health, education, we can and have eliminated diseases from the planet. As a review of vaccination, remember this is kind of an old table, but we did see more recent statistics in the last section. But vaccination, just in the US alone, has reduced the amount of infectious disease for particular infections by 80% or more. Sometimes in the US, we have 0 cases annually. The overall goal of vaccination is really simple: prevent people from getting a dangerous infection. Now, one of the things that I really want to make clear to you is that in some cases, vaccination won't necessarily prevent you from getting the infection ever. And I think we all probably have experienced a situation where maybe we were vaccinated against the flu or we were vaccinated against COVID-19. And we still got the infection. There are a number of different reasons for this. One of them is that with some of these infections, especially with like the flu and with COVID, their genetics make it so that they are much more likely to change and evolve over time. And when they do, they might be slightly different than what we were vaccinated against. And so maybe the vaccine and our immune response aren't perfect for the virus that we've actually been exposed to. And with COVID, Delta, Omicron, whatever variants are coming around. And even though we know that they're just different flavors, I guess, of COVID, our immune system sometimes sees them as a completely different virus. So it may not know exactly how to fight it. But, at least in my own personal experience, so I'll only speak for myself, I know that in situations where I have been vaccinated against an infection like the flu or COVID, and I have still gotten the infection, my disease symptoms were far more mild. For example, I've been vaccinated against COVID, I've been boosted, and last Thanksgiving, right after Thanksgiving, I got COVID, even though I had been boosted and vaccinated, but I never lost my sense of smell or taste. I never couldn't get out of bed. I ran a fever for about 8 to 12 hours, and I had a stuffy nose and a sore throat for a couple of days. That was it. And, it could have been a lot worse. So you either are preventing people from acquiring a dangerous infection, or you're preventing them from experiencing severe symptoms of disease. Now, in principle, the idea would be if a disease is unique to humans, it didn't come from animals, it doesn't get transmitted by mosquitoes, only humans get the infection. In theory, a really great vaccination campaign should be able to eliminate the disease. One of the challenges is that a lot of diseases are not unique to humans. We know that flu comes from animals. We know that COVID-19 came from animals. The idea then is that continued vaccination, continued boosters should help either keep the disease from the population or, again, to keep the population from getting really severe disease. As we discussed last time, vaccination is vitally important to public health. And again, maybe you will get COVID even if you've been vaccinated, but you most likely won't be hospitalized, and there's a very, 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 very low chance of severe complications in a vaccinated patient. It can still happen, but it's very, very rare. But for things like diphtheria, whooping cough, smallpox, right? Once a person has been vaccinated, it's almost a guarantee that they won't get the infection. So it's really important for public health. However, as again, we also discussed, vaccination rates have declined in the past 10 to 15 years. So as you are kind of taking notes on this and as you're studying for your exam, think about what are some reasons that we've talked about why vaccination rates have declined. And are there reasons that we didn't talk about that you've thought of that perhaps vaccination rates could have declined? But there have been 2 successful vaccination campaigns that have completely eliminated diseases from the planet. There are no infections with these 2 diseases anymore. The first you've probably heard of, smallpox. The second is a disease of cattle, and it's called rinderpest. It's very closely related to measles. In fact, it's thought that human measles evolved from rinderpest thousands of years ago and jumped into the human population once humans and animals started living together. See, there's another consequence of humans and animals living in close contact. And the use of vaccination is really why these campaigns were successful. So smallpox eradication is the only disease that's been completely eliminated from humans. And the first vaccine was developed by Edward Jenner in the late 1700s. During the 1800s, people were still getting vaccinated, but it was during the first part of the 19th century, so the early 1900s, that countries worldwide established mandatory vaccination. So yes, the government in many countries told you must be vaccinated against smallpox. In some areas, there was still distrust over the vaccine and a preference for other methods like the variolation. Remember the blowing of the smallpox particles into the nose? And that really prevented success of eradicating the disease in certain parts of the world. However, in the US, vaccination was very successful. It was very well accepted. Almost everybody got vaccinated. And because almost everybody in the US got vaccinated, by 1900, smallpox was considered almost eliminated from the US. And by 1914, most industrialized nations, or developed nations, or whatever you want to call them, had very low levels of infection. So 1914, we're talking about like by the beginning of World War I, the majority of the industrialized countries had very low levels of infection. And so this is a flyer that was published in San Francisco. If a patient had smallpox, this would be put on the door that somebody in this house has smallpox, don't come in. So by the mid 20th century, so maybe 1950 or so, the disease was eliminated from most of the Americas. So that would be North, Central, and South America, with the exception of 4 countries, Argentina, Brazil, Ecuador, and Colombia. The World Health Assembly, which eventually became the World Health Organization, in 1959 passed a resolution to eliminate smallpox worldwide. That was their goal. Let's get rid of smallpox. Because even though so many countries had really eliminated the infection, including what we would consider developing nations, right? Not just industrialized nations, there were still a number of countries that had infections. In fact, 2 million people approximately were dying every year, with approximately 50 million cases worldwide per year, as late as 1959. So the strategy that they did was called ring vaccination. So they would identify a patient who'd been infected, and they would vaccinate everybody who had come into direct contact with that infected patient. These were called first degree exposures. And they would vaccinate everybody who had come into contact with the person who came into contact with the infected person. And these were called second-degree exposures. So to use an example, it would be something like, let's say in your class, like not in our class because we meet online, but let's say in one of your in-person classes, if one of your classmates came up with smallpox, we're talking like, this is not really going to happen, but what if it did? If a person in your class has smallpox, they are the primary infection. They are this person here highlighted in red. Everybody else in the room, that would be your professor, your classmates, you are considered the primary exposure because you were in contact with this person. It's a respiratory infection. So if you were in the same room as this person for an hour or an hour and a half, you were exposed. So you would all be vaccinated, your professor, your classmates. Your secondary vaccination would be, do you live with your family? Well, it would be your family members because they come into contact with you. Or if you have roommates, or you have a significant other, or your children, or your coworkers who you come in direct contact with, those would be your secondary contacts. They would all be vaccinated. But that's where the vaccination would stop. We wouldn't go for your coworkers' family, or your, if you live with your mom and dad, your mom's coworkers. That's a little bit too distant. So we would vaccinate you and your close contacts. So this worked really well because people who have smallpox are pretty obvious, and nobody else wanted to get smallpox, so they were like, please give me the vaccine. And it was also dependent on reporting to agencies like the World Health Organization. So remember, this started in 1959. So 13 years later, by 1972, that's when the last European outbreak happened. So it only took 13 years. 3 years after that, smallpox was isolated to the continent of Africa and only a few countries within Africa. And by 1977, so 18 years after the beginning of the campaign, the last naturally occurring case of smallpox occurred in Somalia. And I always feel bad for this guy. This is the guy who had the last case of smallpox. He lived. He's totally fine. But he's like, seriously, y'all are taking my picture. I got smallpox. Could you just leave me alone? But that's okay. So that was the last naturally occurring case, 1977. However, it wasn't the last infection. The last infection was a British medical photographer named Janet Parker, and she was infected in 1978. So she worked in a hospital setting where her, her office or her main area of work was above a lab that worked on smallpox. Now, the lead scientist in the lab, he wasn't really allowed to keep working on smallpox. He didn't have a proper facility. This is a disease that's transmitted through the air. So you would need really significant air filtration. You need those you've probably seen them in movies and stuff, the cabinets where people work on bacteria and viruses that cause disease. And so she actually died of the infection, and he died by suicide while he was in quarantine. He felt so guilty about causing her death. Now, the idea, again, behind smallpox eradication was that the vaccination against smallpox worked for one very important reason, but a couple of other important reasons as well. But this is the most important. The most important reason that smallpox vaccination and smallpox eradication worked is because smallpox is a disease of humans only. Only humans get smallpox. There are no animals out there holding smallpox. There are no insects out there holding smallpox. Smallpox only was in people. So if there are no more people to get smallpox because you've vaccinated and protected all of them, there is no more smallpox. If it can't infect humans, it can't survive. Viruses don't survive outside of a host. They don't live in the environment. They have to be inside of the organism they infect. And if they're not in there, they're gone. One of the other reasons that smallpox vaccination worked really well is that it doesn't change. The virus doesn't change like COVID and the flu do. Like every year it's a new flu. Every couple months it's a new COVID, right? Omicron, Delta, whatever. Smallpox was always smallpox was always smallpox. So if you were protected against smallpox, you were protected against smallpox. And so that was really helpful in eliminating the disease.